Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and like I do with some of these, this is another attempt at this. And the reason I start this podcast and then I get in the weeds with something, because some of the stuff is really hard for me not to just go right into the woods with it. But I'm going to do my best. What we're talking about today is really the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which would be our third installment of self-inquiry. This in the self-inquiry component of spirituality is what leads you to the soul and eventually leads you to God. And it is the constant questioning and the turning it this way, turning it that way, flipping it over. What about this? What about that? So in that first episode, I guess 2 weeks ago, I really was just giving you questions, things to consider, like, what's objective, what's subjective, what exists. The second one, we talked about awareness, that there's this thing in you that is simply aware. This one is a little different, but how last week correlated to our first Wednesday of every month group, this will correlate to our second Wednesday, which is that's the $30 tier on Patreon. That is the Bhagavad Gita study group. So this one, we are really starting, we're right on the edge of mysticism, right? But I do these things in steps because, like any spiritual practice, the way I was taught is you have to understand these things. Like, if you understand this, then you can move to this. Skipping these steps, you're kind of getting, you could end up in a bad spot to where you don't understand. And I talk about this in one of those Substack essays, the first one, Americans, the spiritual latchkey kids of the Western world, that the bird has two wings, that you can't just have experiences with no intellectual component, i.e. texts and things like that. You have to have both, because if you just have experiences with no intellectual understanding, those texts have explanations for the experience. Otherwise, your ego is explaining the experience. And then if you are, just intellectually interested, but you don't have any experience, then, like I said, you're just annoying at parties. You're that guy. You got to have both. And that's what enriches the whole thing. So that's why I do this in steps. But before we get into that, go to the website, click the About button, read a little bit about me. If you'd like to book one-on-one time with me to start a meditation practice, deepen your practice, start a spiritual practice, deepen your practice. Maybe you're interested in thought transformation and restructuring, which is a modality that I've developed over the years of moving trauma around the brain, dealing with anxiety, ruminating thoughts. Maybe you want me to do a workshop or a talk at your yoga school or some other place. Reach out through email or Instagram direct message. I just say Instagram because that's where I'm the most active. If you want to do one-on-one stuff. If you would like to support me in other ways, there's the shop that is very helpful. There's some new t-shirts up there. If you'd like to donate, there's a participate/donate button. Maybe you just love the content. You can donate through Venmo or PayPal. Then the participate portion of that would be the Patreon. There are 5 tiers. The three tiers of Journey, Awake, and Insight are, in my opinion, where you get your money's worth, because the Journey tier is $10 a month. Awake tier is $10 a month. The Insight tier is $30 a month. Journey obviously gives you access to the first Wednesday. Awake gives you access to the first and the third. Insight gives you access to the second, the third, and the first Wednesday. And again, those go in steps for a reason. I can't just tell you guys crazy things. I feel like, these things aren't so, like, the mystical isn't so inaccessible. It's very accessible, and you can get there through critical thinking, which is what I'm kind of going to do today, or attempt to. So, like I said, 2 weeks ago, we talked about, we really just started asking the question about subjectivity, objectivity, existence. Last week was awareness, noticing that there is a noticer, noticing that there is an aspect, a quality within you that is simply noticing before the mind steps in and has an opinion. now we get to the next phase, which is the second chapter of the Gita, which is sometimes called the knowledge of the imperishable self, the yoga of the imperishable self, the yoga of self-realization, the knowledge of self. But it's about self-realization. And this is where we get into the actual experience, and we need the meditative practice to get there. That's where we start to do that thing we talked about last week, where we identify with the awareness and notice that there's something that is simply aware of depression that is not depressed. There's something aware of sadness that is not sad. There's something aware of happiness and joy and good feelings that is not actually experiencing those things. It is just pointing. Okay? So what we're really talking about, what Krishna is talking about, trying to correct Arjuna's thinking, because this starts out with, again, the first chapter of the Gita is Arjuna just sad and being a fucking crybaby, and Krishna's like, what are you, like, chapter 2 opens with Krishna being like, what are you doing? Like, this isn't like you. Why are you acting so fucking weird? Well, we have to have something to talk about in the Gita, because through the whole Mahabharata, which the Gita is part of the Mahabharata, Arjuna isn't like this. And this might be that thing where it's one thing to talk about spirituality. It's one thing to talk about renunciation. It's one thing to talk about these. It's another thing to put it into practice. And like we talked about with the first chapter, the things that Arjuna is lamenting, it's more complex than just family. That's channel 1. The higher channels are really, the family's basic cable. But if you want like the good stuff, it's an allegory that the family, Bhishma, Drona, his cousins, all represent aspects of the self that, the scared small self, the ego, is afraid to let go of. Like Bhishma representing the individualized self, the ego, that's the reality testing portion. Those of you in the Patreon that are reading The Eternal Way, the Gita book by Roy Eugene Davis, Bhishma represents, like he says, the individualized self, but it's really the ego. That's the reality testing function of the ego. Reality testing meaning that you're the belief that you're a separate thing in the universe, right? Drona representing memories in the past and like what we think we know, right? We think we know things because of the past. So it's the fear of letting go of those things, because what happens is the world starts to dissolve. The next Substack essay that's coming out is, that's something else I forgot to mention. There's a Substack now. The third one is about reality, that it starts to fold in on itself. It doesn't make any sense. And for the spiritual aspirant, which I'm assuming that's why you're listening to this, it's kind of scary. It's like when you first kind of dive into meditation and you sit long enough, or you eat enough mushrooms, and everything kind of just, you just realize some things. Again, not know intellectually, but you realize it deeply that you don't exist. There is no Keith. Keith is a concept, right? We went over that last week. I'm not going to get back into it. So really once Krishna starts to speak, he's letting Arjuna know, he's like, hey, did you know that you're not Arjuna? Did you know that you are actually an imperishable, infinite being that was never born and will never die? There's not a moment where you or the kings and the men on this battlefield did not exist. You were never born and you will never die. I think it is the wise lament neither for the living nor the dead. You were never born and you will never die. And again, this is the introduction of the concept of soul or self. The word soul doesn't actually get used in the Gita. It's the self. It talks about the self and merging with Brahman, the source. So you say that, and it's like, well, now you're asking me to just believe in another concept. And I am, on one level, yes. But let's go back to last week when I mentioned awareness. And this is something that Michael Singer mentions in Untethered Soul that's really great. I love the way he put it. That there's an aspect of you, and I'm not wording exactly like him, but there's a piece of you, an aspect of you that looks in the mirror and it notices age. It notices, oh, that thing was 16 and now it's 36, right? It's noticing changes. It's noticing before the mind steps in and starts to judge, well, I don't like the way my face droops there, it just notices, and it noticed change. It didn't have an opinion about change, it just noticed it. And that's the first step of this, right? You start to notice that. But then this thing Krishna's talking about, he's asking you to believe that that is not associated with the body. This is something I've mentioned, that I believed that in our lifetime we would all be privy to the fact that consciousness is not located within the body, is not attached to the body. Those of you that have had out-of-body experiences, those of you that have had, maybe remote viewing experiences, or more so out-of-body, and those of you that have maybe psychic experiences, ESP, you know this, right? I myself have had a lot of out-of-body experiences, a lot of strange things dealing with consciousness, and I know that there is an aspect of me that isn't associated with this body because it leaves the body. I wrote a little bit about it, I think in Agreement. But, you can have these experiences in breath work, you can have these experiences due to trauma, you hear these stories, and either all of these people are crazy and lying, and I'm lying, and everybody's lying, or that's real. And granted, that doesn't lead you to a realization, it just leads you to an intellectual belief, like, okay, well, I guess, but it's still so unbelievable, right? It's so unbelievable. But what is that? Like, I don't know that it's soul. Soul's just a word that we use, right? Maybe it's because they say the intellect is just below the soul, below Atman, which is the word for the self, or the soul. Soul is just a word that we use, right? That there's an aspect of us that's not associated with this body. Some of you had that experience just in, due to trauma, like bad things were happening to you and you left your body. Very common, right? And it's kind of wild. Like, so what is it that saw that, right? What is it that saw you? What is it that had that perspective? And like, these materialists have a lot of explanations that don't make sense. And they can't prove any of it. And often we have these experiences and it's realer than real. It makes more sense than normal waking consciousness, it's, so it's a tough thing, right? I'm releasing these binaural beats, right? If they're I'm starting to release them onto Insight Timer and SoundCloud. So if you go on SoundCloud and search The Infinite Spark of Being, or if you go on Insight Timer and search a teacher profile of The Infinite Spark of Being or Keith Welsh, you'll find them. And ultimately, that'll be part of this app that I'm going to be releasing. I had some of my first experiences with HemiSync ages ago. Long before people found out the CIA was using that. For old school conspiracy people or old school paranormal folks, we've been hip to HemiSync for a minute. we knew about the third eye spy stuff for years. But, you know, it took COVID for some of you guys to get interested in anything that wasn't right front and center coming out of Dan Rather's mouth. You know, so I was having these experiences, but I want to start working to give you guys that experience. So some of these binaural beats could help facilitate that for you. I'm going to be, you know, getting more into that and telling you guys more about it. But we start to look at something like my experience with Reverend Margaret Schmidt. What was that? You know, because the way we think, the things we concern ourselves about, like, they get in the way of pure consciousness or the soul or spirit or Atman or whatever we're talking about, because we inhabit the body and the body's worried about dying. A lot of our thoughts and things have a lot to do with biological imperatives that are just, you know, trying to stay alive. Once that goes, like, well, now what? Like, once you don't have to think about a body, like, the ego is due to having a body. The ego is just a function of the body that goes, well, we got to stay alive. We have to have personal importance, personal identity, reality testing. We need all these things so we can propagate the species. Once you get rid of that, what's going on? You know, the mind gets wrapped up in the body, thought. I mean, we know that, you know, your gut biome can affect the thinking mind, you know. That's real. But then we have that awareness thing, and we can move awareness around in our body. We couldn't control the initial thought, but we could control this piece of us that noticed that thinking was happening and then decided to think differently. So the second chapter of the Gita is Krishna going, hey, you are Atman. You are the self, capital S. That's you. There is no slain and there is no slayer. It's foolish to think that there's a you know, he's just talking about the battlefield, a slayer and a slain. You know, and he starts to discuss the fact that Krishna starts to say, look, like, when you can see pleasure and pain, victory and defeat, once you can see all of these things evenly as phenomena, and you cannot attach to the outcome of these events, then you're starting to experience yoga. Now you're doing yoga, right? And what he means is that, I think I mentioned this the other day, last week in the episode, about, like, can you sit down and you sit down to play checkers, and yeah, you want to win, but, you know, do you flip the fucking table over when you don't? Some of you might, but, you know, it's like, hey, we're playing a game, all right, I lost, okay. That's how Krishna is asking Arjuna to look at life. Sorry, I'm on a bumpy road. I get here sometimes on this road, you know, it's Palm Beach, and I think they don't pave this because this is where, like if you want to come to the beach on Palm Beach and visit as a tourist, like, you come here and they're like, fuck these people. Which I understand this sentiment. Don't come to Florida, it's horrible. Stay away. We're obviously just a bunch of crazy people with horrible weather, with hurricanes. Like, every other day there's a hurricane. Yeah. Build that wall by Canada. Sorry guys, just kidding. All right, so Florida jokes. So there is an aspect to us that is imperishable. That's what Krishna is trying to tell Arjuna. But then Arjuna eventually goes, hold on. If these people, like, how do these people, like, how do they sit? How do they act? Like, who are these people? And then Krishna, you know, begins to tell him. He says, you know, they're like the ocean, that all of the streams and all of the rivers flow into the ocean. The ocean never overflows. It's just always the ocean. That is the saying that all that phenomena occur: pleasure, pain, guilt, blame, fame, shame, all of it, right? That's why they say that the second chapter is essentially the Gita. That's the whole thing. That's what we're going to discuss Wednesday. I'm going to go over certain verses and certain pieces of that chapter. The Bhagavad Gita really is the ultimate guidebook. Because I know that what I'm saying is a little vague, but he gives instructions. There's instructions later on, like how to meditate, how to do these things. What to do. Bringing your mind to a single pointed place. There's something to that when the mind gets quiet, like all these things open up to it. I think one of those reasons is because what we do know is that, one of the side effects of a dedicated meditative practice is that the default mode network in the brain opens up. Well, it shuts down, not shuts down completely, but it lessens. And the default mode network is this curated reality. It's like when it settles down, you have a broader view of things. You can see outside of your own attached point of view. So 2 weeks ago, it was, all right, so this is what objective means. Is something to be objectively true, it's without personal preferences, opinions, and tastes. Subjective is things that we have opinions and preferences and personal taste. Right there alone, you start to look at the world differently. Like, well, there is no objectivity. It really is just all subjectivity. Yeah, and it's all the mind, right? And then with that, it was like, okay, well, what's existence? Well, existence requires objectivity. So Keith doesn't exist. Okay, so what does? Well, awareness is something. You can notice awareness. You can touch base with awareness. And essentially what Krishna is saying in the second chapter is, well, that's you. The watcher, the observer, the noticer. That's you. The caring, thinking mind is not you. It's the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is that life is fundamentally unsatisfying and suffering. Well, why? Well, because the second noble truth, the grasping and clinging, if I could just have this, if I only had that, if I could just, that creates the dissatisfaction and the suffering, because every time you get the thing that you want, love, money, fame, whatever, then it's on to the next one. It doesn't bring you any lasting happiness. And definitely doesn't bring you contentment, because you'll forget about the shiny object and you move on to the next one. And then the third noble truth is that, hey, you can wake up now. You don't have to die and wait for your great reward. You can have it now. And the other piece of the third noble truth is that, like, it's not you that suffers. It's not you that grasps and clings. It's the mind, it's the body that does that, because that's not you. And that's where we get into anatta. Like, you're not the suffering, grasping, clinging small self. You're the piece that notices the grasping and clinging of the small self. That knowledge doesn't mean that you no longer grasp and cling. It just means that now you're aware that it's happening. And simply being aware that it's happening lessens it. But then where we end up with the grasping and the clinging is we end up with the second chapter of the Gita, what Krishna's talking about. That I can grasp for something, and if I get it, great. If I don't, great. I can cling to something. If it stays, great. If it doesn't, great. That's karma yoga, selfless service. I'm in service doing. This is kind of how the translation works. Selfless, meaning that I'm not attached to the self. It comes and it goes. So the path of selfless service, or karma yoga, doesn't mean that you work in a soup kitchen on the weekends. It means that you work without attachment to the outcome. That's what Krishna is trying to explain to Arjuna, is that the true self isn't concerned with living and dying and da-da-da-da-da. Doesn't mean that you don't concern yourself with it. It just means that you have to do both. Like Jesus said, you're in the world but not of the world. Am I ultimately just awareness, self, soul? Yeah. ultimately I am the disembodied, imperishable thing that watches. I'm also the grid that it all comes out of. Source conscious is the fountainhead of all things, but I'm also a living organism that is doing, and that's the idea of the divine play. That's the Leela. You play the role of the human being. You play the role of the man, woman, child. You play that role, but you're not attached to the outcome. And that sounds difficult for people. And that doesn't mean that you don't try your best. It doesn't mean that you don't want something. It just means that you understand that it might not happen. And that's okay too. But what I've found in my life is that if I understand that second chapter of the Gita, things kind of fall in line. These last 8 months, I've put everything that I believe to the test. And so far, it's coming out in a way that I couldn't have imagined. And that's what the fourth book is going to be about. Just showing that these things work. But it's really interesting. My friend Troy sails, and I don't know anything about sailing. He was saying, you're holding these lines, and the boat is going and going and going. The wind's got it, and I go, well, what happens if you need to stop or you're gonna hit something? He goes, you just let go. When you let go, everything stops. Everything goes limp, and it doesn't hold any wind, and it just kind of stops. And that's such a great metaphor for everything, is if you just let go, you lay in the river. That's karma yoga. It doesn't, again, it's like equanimity. To be equanimous means no strong emotional response, evenness of temper. It doesn't mean you don't care. It just means that you're not, crazy about it. You look at the first patriarch of Zen. The great way is easy for those without preference. It's not that you don't have preference. It's more so that you're not attached to the preference. Everyone has a preference. Everyone wants it to land one way or the other, right? But you're okay with either one. And again, it doesn't mean there's not. You'll notice some things sting more than others. So the thing that feels the sting or doesn't feel the sting, that's the small self. That's Keith. The thing that just notices that phenomena is occurring, that's Keith too, or that's just the self. It doesn't have a name, I guess. I don't know if I'd call the soul Keith, because the soul's been billions of names. So this third installment is the second chapter of the Gita, which is the knowledge of the imperishable self, that there's a quality in you that is never born and it will never die. And it's that piece of awareness that notices change, notices phenomena, but doesn't necessarily have an opinion about it. It's the flash right before the evaluation. It's the flash of awareness right before it's flooded with the same old goofy thoughts. That's the imperishable self. And that's where I'm going to leave this. And then next week we have to get into a little bit of mysticism. So, thanks. You guys are really nice to me, and I appreciate it. Go to theinfinitesparkofme.com. Read a little bit about me on the About page. If you want to book some one-on-one time, you want me to give a talk, want me to do a workshop on a weekend, reach out through email or direct message. Follow me on Substack. It's all essays. It'll be a lot of my editorializing things. It's like more so not that you don't get enough of my opinions, but a little my snarky side. Yes, it can be more snarky. Join the Patreon. If you don't want to join the Patreon, you pay $20 a pop for each. Every time you attend, just pay it through PayPal or Venmo. Be sure to get me your email address. Buy some t-shirts. Only Love is Real is the newest one that's on there. A little heart chakra deal in there. Take a look at it. Let me know what you think. All this stuff. Leave a review. Give me stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, all the things. I love you. I love you. I love you. I'll see you guys on Wednesday. All right, bye.